You don't have a money problem. You have a never enough problem. And the terrifying part? More money didn't fix it. It just upgraded the anxiety. You know this. Somewhere underneath the spreadsheets and the savings goals and the careful, responsible planning, you already know this. The number grew, the income grew, the accounts grew, and the feeling stayed exactly where it was, sitting in your chest, quiet, patient, completely unmoved by your progress. You crossed thresholds you once thought were the finish line. You got there, you looked around, and then you set another one. This is not a story about someone else. This is about the specific, private experience of earning well, doing most things right, and still waking up with a low hum of financial dread that you cannot fully explain and cannot seem to outrun. That's where we're starting. Let me be direct about who this is for and who it isn't. This isn't for someone making reckless decisions. It isn't for someone who hasn't done the work. The person watching this is almost certainly done the work. You've read what you were supposed to read, learned what you were supposed to learn. You understand the fundamentals of money better than most people around you. You've probably explained compound interest to someone who asked, and meant it, and were right. You are not financially irresponsible. You are not impulsive. You are not someone who avoids thinking about money. If anything, you think about it too much. You track it, revisit it, recalculate it at odd hours. You run numbers in your head during conversations that have nothing to do with money. You're the person who plans 3 years ahead and still feels unprepared. That's not failure, that's a pattern, and there's a real difference. The person who fails financially usually doesn't know why. You know why. You just can't seem to apply what you know to the way you actually feel. And that gap between knowing and feeling is what nobody talks about honestly, because it's uncomfortable, because admitting it sounds ungrateful, because from the outside, your financial life looks like it's working, and you're not entirely sure you have permission to say it still doesn't feel like enough. You have that permission here.
Stop for a second. Here's what's actually happening. And it's more specific than wanting too much or lacking gratitude. Those framings let the real mechanism off the hook. What's happening is this. Your internal threshold for financial security rises at approximately the same rate as your actual financial position, which means you never close the gap, not because the gap is real, but because the gap is generated by your own mind. Recalibrated automatically, continuously, and just convincingly enough that it always feels justified. You're not chasing wealth, you're chasing relief, and relief never arrives because by the time you reach the number, you've already moved it. This isn't weakness, it isn't greed, and it isn't unique to you. But here's where it gets uncomfortable, and this is the part most people won't admit. Your intelligence is making this worse. A less analytical person reaches a financial milestone and accepts it. You reach the same milestone and immediately generate 5 well-reasoned, entirely legitimate arguments for why it isn't quite enough yet. You're not wrong about those arguments. The future is uncertain. Costs do expand. Risks are real. But you're also not questioning whether the anxiety driving that analysis is giving you accurate information, or whether it's just the pattern running. You moved the goal, then blamed reality for not being stable enough. That's the trap. Not a moral failing, not a character flaw, a trap designed precisely to catch people who are smart enough to build a convincing case for staying in it. The mechanism has a name in research, the aspiration attainment gap. But I want to explain what it actually feels like, because the academic label makes it sound more distant than it is. At some point, probably early, possibly before you were making any real money, you developed a felt sense of what financial safety looked like. Not a number, a feeling, a threshold. It was built from what you watched growing up, from what felt precarious, from comparisons you absorbed without consciously making them, from real moments of scarcity, or the anticipation of it, or simply from understanding that things could be taken away. That felt sense became your internal reference point. And here's the thing about that reference point. It doesn't update well like your bank balance does. It updates emotionally, socially, comparatively, and it updates fast, faster than you'd expect every time your circumstances genuinely improve. So the loop goes like this. You reach a milestone, there's a brief, real moment of satisfaction, sometimes a day, sometimes a week, occasionally a few months. And then, quietly, almost without your participation, the brain recalibrates. It scans your environment, your awareness of risk, your social reference group, the future you've now made more visible by making progress, and it updates what secure needs to look like. The new threshold isn't invented, it's derived from real observations, which is exactly why it never feels like moving goalposts. It feels like a reasonable revision. Your income grew, your fear grew with it. And because the revised threshold is always slightly beyond reach, it generates anxiety. Not crisis anxiety, nothing that dramatic, just low-grade, persistent background anxiety. The kind your mind immediately attaches to the nearest concrete cause. Once we pay this off, when we hit that number, after the kids finish school. The cause feels specific, solvable, which means the pattern feels manageable. But the anxiety isn't about the car payment, it isn't about the school fees. It's about a gap that reconstitutes after every solution. Because the gap isn't in your finances, it's in the relationship between where you are and where your mind insists you need to be. And the behavior this produces, working harder, saving more, optimizing obsessively, is all rational, all productive. None of it touches the mechanism. Because the mechanism isn't waiting to be solved, it's waiting to be seen.
This channel examines the psychological patterns underneath financial decisions, the ones operating below the level of logic in people who already understand the logic. If that kind of clarity is useful to you, this is the right place to be. A man checks his bank account at night. The balance is higher than it's ever been, higher than he thought it would be at this age, genuinely. He stares at the number, and then he feels the familiar tightness in his chest. Not relief, not satisfaction, the same thing that was there before. He closes the app, tells himself he'll feel better when the mortgage is a few years further along, goes to sleep, sets the alarm. That's not a dramatic story. That's a Tuesday. And the version of it you live might look slightly different, but the shape of it is probably familiar. Think about the last time your financial situation genuinely improved. A raise, a good year, an unexpected windfall of some kind. Notice what happened in the weeks that followed. There was probably a real brief sense of relief, and then, almost without a conscious decision, that relief converted into a revised picture of what was now possible, the thing you'd been deferring, the account you now knew you should be building, the new level of preparation that suddenly seemed within reach. None of those revised priorities were wrong. Every one of them was reasonable, but the anxiety didn't decrease proportionally. If anything, having more resources just made more visible how far there was still to go. Most people won't admit this next part. The lifestyle you've built, the one that feels like the normal, modest version of your life given what you earn, is expensive enough that the margin between income and outflow feels tighter than it should. Not because you're irresponsible, because your reference group defines normal at a certain level. Your self-concept has aligned with that level, and stepping back from it doesn't feel like a choice anymore. It feels like loss. So you carry the gap quietly. Don't mention it in mixed company. Nod when people assume your income means you're not worried about money. Let them assume. Or this version. You're facing a financial decision that is, by any honest analysis, completely reasonable. You've thought it through. The math holds. You make the decision.
And within hours, sometimes minutes, there's an unease that settles in. Not regret about the decision itself, just a quiet voice that says, "Should have kept that." That voice isn't about the money, that's the gap talking. And if you're honest with yourself right now, not careful, not measured, actually honest, you don't even know what enough would feel like anymore. Not really. You've been moving toward it for so long that you've lost the picture of what it looked like when you started. That's not a small thing to sit with.
Name the number in your head. Not a range, not it depends, a number. Now watch what your mind does next. Don't skip past that. Whatever just happened, the qualification, the condition, the immediate revision, that's the whole thing, right there, in 3 seconds. That's the mechanism you've been living inside of. I want to be precise here. This isn't about alarming you. It's about what this costs, measured accurately across time, not in a single month where it's easy to dismiss, but across a decade where it quietly accumulates into something that matters. The first cost is the most constant. It's the background noise. Persistent, low-grade financial anxiety is not neutral, not even when it's mostly manageable, not even when it never tips into genuine crisis. Living with that hum underneath everything affects sleep, affects clarity, how fully present you are in the parts of your life that have nothing to do with money. That's not a small thing. Over 10 years, it isn't a small thing at all. But here's the more subtle cost. When your emotional experience of security doesn't respond proportionally to financial improvement, the logical conclusion, the rational response, is to keep prioritizing financial improvement. More hours, deferred experiences, decisions made from anxiety rather than from genuine preference, a consistent tilt in the direction of more over the direction of present. That tilt doesn't look dramatic from the inside. It just looks like being responsible, but it compounds. Not in your accounts, there it may look quite healthy. It compounds in the parts of life that don't wait for you to feel secure before proceeding. Relationships move forward without full presence. Health gets the time you have left after everything else. The experiences you were going to have when things felt more settled don't accumulate in a holding account. They just pass. And the regret that surfaces years later isn't usually about a specific decision. It's more diffuse than that. It's the recognition that the anxiety that drove the accumulation never actually resolved, that the accumulation kept promising relief, and the relief kept arriving briefly and then departing. That's the real cost. Not poverty, not financial failure, something quieter. A life lived in permanent preparation for a level of security that the mechanism was never going to deliver.
I'm going to offer some statements, not questions, just observations. See which ones land close. When something improves financially, your first instinct is to identify what's still unresolved before you've finished processing what improved. You find it genuinely difficult to feel secure in the present because the present always feels like it's supposed to be preparation for something the future might require. The number that once represented your goal now feels like your floor, and you have no clear memory of deciding to move it. You've had the moments of real financial progress and noticed, with some confusion, that the satisfaction felt exactly as temporary as it always had. You're not wrong, but you're also not questioning the one thing that's controlling everything. And you haven't been for years. You've had the quiet, recurring suspicion, not as a serious belief, just as something that passes through, that you might be constitutionally incapable of feeling financially secure, that this is just how you're built.
These aren't diagnostic. There's nothing to score. But if several of them produced a kind of quiet, slightly uncomfortable recognition, not because your finances are failing, but because the internal experience they describe is accurate, then you're seeing the pattern, maybe for the first time with enough clarity to actually hold it still. That's not nothing.
Here's what changes when you can actually see the mechanism. And I want to be specific because this isn't a pivot to solutions. There are no solutions offered here. What changes is the relationship between you and the experience. When the gap between where you are and where you feel you need to be generates anxiety, and you have no framework for why, that anxiety presents itself as accurate information. It feels like a warning about your circumstances. It feels like something you should respond to. And so you respond to it rationally and intelligently by trying to close the gap. When you can see the mechanism, you gain the ability to ask a different question. Not, how do I close this gap? But, is this gap telling me something true about my actual situation? Or is this just the pattern running? That question doesn't dissolve the feeling, but it introduces a small space between the feeling and the automatic response to it. And in that space, something different becomes possible. Not action, not a fix, just observation, a slightly cleaner view of what's actually happening, separate from what the anxiety insists is happening. The pattern developed for real reasons. It was built in response to real conditions, a world that did contain genuine financial uncertainty, a version of your life where vigilance was necessary and relaxing the standard felt genuinely dangerous. It served you. It may still serve you in some ways. It also never learned to register enough. Not because it's broken, but because for most of its existence, enough wasn't stable, and trusting it felt like a risk not worth taking. That's what you're working with. Understanding that, actually understanding it, not just acknowledging it, is different from being controlled by it without knowing you're being controlled.
So here's where we land. If the number keeps growing, and the feeling never changes, then the problem was never the number. It was the belief that the number could fix something the number was never designed to fix. More money didn't fail you. The expectation you placed on it did. And that expectation will follow the next number just as faithfully as it followed every number before it, until you can see it clearly enough to stop mistaking it for reality. That's not hopelessness. That's precision. If something in this created recognition, not comfort, not resolution, just recognition, leave it in the comments. Not what you're going to do, just what you noticed. That's the start of something different.